So thank you everybody for coming tonight to our Revolutions panel discussion on limited equity housing cooperatives. And I apologize, I'm reading from a paper. So Tim is sick with the flu, which a lot of people have been getting. It's a nasty strain right now. So I'm just going to read some of the comments that we're looking forward to an informative, robust discussion tonight, and we're grateful to have an impressive line of presenters who we'll introduce in just a moment. So, for those of you who are not familiar with our Revolution, we are an official local chapter of Bernie Sanders' National Our Revolution organization. We are a nonpartisan, issues-focused grassroots group seeking to galvanize and organize Arlington residents of all walks of life to fight for a bold, progressive agenda that will transform our community into a more democratic, just, and sustainable place. So, in light of what we see as mounting systemic problems with our economy and environment, our revolution believes that we need a new approach to economic development that creates an inclusive, sustainable economy built on locally rooted and broad-based ownership models. One of those models is Limited Equity Housing Cooperative, or LEC, which we believe should be explored here in Arlington as a way to combat the trend toward the demolition of market-rate affordable apartment buildings and the displacement of their tenants by right rules and state-level impediments notwithstanding. So, here to talk with us tonight about Washington DC's experience with LECs and the law that helped increase the use of this tool to combat gentrification-induced displacement of low-income tenants are, sorry if they're not, it's not in order, but number one, Amanda Huron, who is Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Social Science at UDC, University of District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. She is an urban geographer with a particular interest in housing, gentrification, the decommodification of land, and the history of Washington, D.C. In her new book, Carving Out the Commons, Tenant Organizing and Housing Cooperatives in Washington, D.C., she theorizes the urban commons through examining the experiences of limited equity co-ops in the fast gentrifying city of Washington, D.C. Amanda serves on the board of Empower DC, a citywide community organizing group that works to empower low and moderate income district residents, including a particular focus on anti-displacement work. She's a native of Washington's Ward 1. Okay. So I have like a paragraph on each of you. Okay. Number two, Ava Seidelman. Did I say it right? Eva Seidelman. Okay. Who is a staff attorney for the Neighborhood Legal Services Program's Housing Cooperative Preservation Initiative, which seeks to provide a variety of services to affordable housing cooperatives owned by low-income tenants, limited equity cooperatives. Prior to working for NLSP, Eva was a fellow at the UDC David Clark School of Law's Community Development Law Clinic, where she supervised students in representing housing cooperatives, small businesses, and nonprofit organizations. Okay, and then Louise Howell is a professor of law at the David Clark School of Law at UDC, also in Washington, D.C. An expert in housing and community development law, Professor Howell developed the Community Development Law Clinic, where she co-directs, and she began her career as a legal services attorney, specializing in employment and housing law. She was subsequently a fellow at Georgetown University Law Center, Harrison Institute for Public Law, working for the development of limited equity housing cooperatives in DC. And Carolyn Gallaher, who is a geographer and an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. And she does research in two distinct fields, political violence and urban geography. Her work in urban geography focuses on DC. In 2016, she wrote a book about DC's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, the The Politics of Staying Put, Condo Conversion, and Tenant Right to Buy in Washington, D.C. She's also a member of the editorial board of Greater Washington. We will start with Amanda, who will set the scene for us about how we might reclaim and maintain the suburban commons and the role of LECs in that process. Next, we will hear from both Eva and Louise, who will speak to their experience on how LECs are set up and how they work. And last but not least, Carolyn will talk to us about Washington, D.C.'s Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and its role in giving low-income tenants first right of refusal when landlords are seeking to sell their building and thus a chance to determine their collective destiny. After our speakers have finished, we'll open up for Q&A. There's not many people here. I don't know if we had been thinking about doing like a circle. Or the camera is set up. Are we good? Maybe we're good. Okay. I can see where people are trickling. Okay. So yeah, Amanda, would you mind starting?
Sure. And about 10 minutes, is that right? That's us, or shorter? Okay. Cool. So yes, thanks. It's exciting to be here, and I'm really excited to be in a panel with these ladies because, this is an incredible pool of talent right here. So to talk about how limited equity co-ops could maybe work in Arlington, I think is really exciting. So just really quickly, I grew up in DC. I've been interested in the question of gentrification for a long time, kind of watching it happen in the neighborhood where I grew up in particular. And yeah, I think it's really exciting to think about this group learning from Burlington, which it sounds like is part of your work, and then also just how cities can learn from each other in terms of our progressive policies. I think we need to do more of that, so it's exciting. So to talk just sort of briefly about the idea of the urban commons, so I did research on limited equity co-ops in DC. It was my dissertation in grad school. I spent about 3 years doing that research and thinking of it as thinking of these co-ops as a form of the urban commons. And when I say urban commons, really what I mean is a resource that's been decommodified and that serves as a sort of direct basis for life as opposed to a resource that you might exchange on the market. And that also is collectively maintained by the people who use it. So it's both been kind of removed from the market in some way, maybe not completely, but in some way, and is also collectively maybe owned, maybe not owned, but definitely managed by the people who use it. And co-ops, limited equity co-ops, I think are a good example of this because of how they operate. And then I think when I was writing and thinking about the urban commons, I was really thinking in terms of, okay, how do people do this kind of work, collectively maintaining these spaces, these resources in cities when so many people actually don't necessarily have a commonality. They kind of are strangers at the beginning of the process. A lot of work has been done on sort of commons in more rural areas around the world. A lot of work, actually, really good work. But that it tends to assume that there's pre-existing long-standing communities that have been together for generations and that are planning to be together for generations. And so it seems different in a city where there's so much movement. Like, how do you make that happen in a city? And when I say city, I mean like Arlington too. I think pretty broadly about that. Is anyone familiar with the limited equity co-op form housing? Okay, cool. So obviously that's what we're talking about. And so it's, and they can be set up in many different ways, and we'll hear about that. But generally, people buy in, it's a co-op in that members own a share in the cooperative association that owns the building. And in limited equity co-ops, people tend to buy in for low amounts, so the price of the share is really low. And in DC, that really ranges from, the price of the share might be similar to like 1 month's carrying charges, the monthly fee, or it might be more. So you buy in for a low amount, and then when you leave, you get that low amount, that share fee back, plus something, some sort of interest. It depends on the co-op. But honestly, most of our co-ops the initial share fee is so low, it's almost more like a zero equity co-op, and so you get a little bit of extra back, but it can depend. You might get more. It's not a financial investment, really. and maybe we can disagree. I mean, we can talk more about that. I mean, maybe in some ways it can. It is a financial investment in that, like, you're socking money away. It's in the co-op, you know, and you would get that piece back when you moved out. Regardless, so you're buying in for a little amount, and then your monthly fees tend to be low as well. So in this research that I did, I was looking in depth at 10 co-ops in the city, and what I found was that looking at their carrying charges, which is what we call the monthly fee, was on average about half for the two bedroom units I looked at. The carrying charges were about half what the fair market rent is, sort of HUD determined fair market rent level, which is sort of an affordability level that HUD sets for 2-bedroom units in the city. And so the rent was, I mean, the carrying charges were much, much more affordable than your typical rent. So that was, so the main thing, and the reason, and we actually have a fair number of limited equity co-ops in the cities, mostly because of the law that Carol's going to talk about, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. But a lot of tenants associations have taken advantage of that law to buy their buildings collectively from their landlords, and to take ownership of them in that way. And I think one of the things that's been exciting about limited equity co-ops in DC is how they have been used to combat displacement. I mean, in a piecemeal way, of course, but still, there's, you know, there are quite a number, you know, there's co-ops in Columbia Heights, there's co-ops in Adams Morgan, there's co-ops in neighborhoods that have really gentrified, and they're continuing to provide affordable housing for folks. And then when I was interviewing people about what was valuable to them about these co-ops, because one of my big questions was, well, if this is not a financial investment in the way that market rate homeownership would be, you know, what else is it that appeals, you know, why are you here? And that's actually a complicated answer, but beyond affordability, which was the main thing, the big thing people talked about was having control over their space. Because as renters, they felt like they just didn't have any control, either physical control over the space or social control over who lived there. The people I talked to were very, very much appreciate the fact that they had, as a co-op, they could determine who was allowed to move in. So there's a lot of interesting questions there. And then the stability of it was really important to them, and community as well. I mean, community was kind of, was people talked about the least of the things they brought up, but it was important for folks too. I think the challenges though of this kind of housing, I mean, it's great. It's like low income, you know, it's affordable ownership of homes that, you know, it's taken off the market. It should be affordable long term. One of the challenges is that it's a lot of work to run them. And even though almost every single co-op in the city uses a management company, I mean, they hire an outside management company, but it's still a tremendous amount of work to manage the management company, as they say. And the work's really unevenly distributed, and it's often highly gendered. I mean, there are definitely men who play leadership roles, but in the selection of co-ops I talked to, it was mostly women who are doing this work. And it can be hard. I mean, co-op board members spend so much time, you know, kind of taking care of the affairs of the co-op that it can be hard to look outward and kind of connect with other co-ops around the city. And there's been various attempts over the years to create those networks. And it's been hard to sustain them because people are so busy dealing with their own situation. And that's actually, I mean, I'm interested in land trusts too, as a sort of larger, and I don't know how much we would be talking about that today, but I know Burlington, for instance, Vermont has like one of the preeminent community land trusts in the country in terms of, yeah, they've done a lot of great work there, and I think a land trust can maybe do more to provide more external support to co-ops. So that's something we might want to touch on. And then I should mention just in the last couple minutes that after I finished this research and like was done with it, I moved into a limited equity co-op, and so I live in one now. And it's very interesting, like to actually be kind of living in that kind of ownership situation. I mean, it's super interesting, you know, and there's a lot to say about that. But it is, and I'm on the board. I feel like I have to be on the board. Like it's what I've studied. I can't not be on the board. But you know, it's a fair amount of work. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into this. Like, you know, there's just people have needs, and when you're living, it's like, you know, it can be a lot of emotional labor. So, and I think one of the challenges of the thing that's tough for a lot of co-ops is just maintaining these spaces over time when you're in the context of such a hot capitalist real estate market. And there's just so much pressure. And there's been a number of co-ops in DC over the years that have chosen to convert to condominium because, you know, they're low-income people who might not have much in the way of savings. It's like they're sitting on a gold mine, you know, and three of the buildings where I did my research had chosen to convert to market rate. And it was very interesting to see what happened next, you know, after that. So I think that's a pressure that a lot of co-ops feel, and they try to decide how to deal with that. So that, I mean, and again, that's why a land trust, I think, can help support co-ops so that they, or even require them, you know, prevent them from choosing to go market at a certain point. Because in the co-op model, each co-op is kind of its own autonomous being, and they can make their own decisions. Their board makes the decisions, and then they do that. In DC, they're required to stay affordable as long as they have financing from the city in the building, and there may be other affordability requirements too, depending on their financing. But once they pay off their city loan, then they could choose to convert to a market rate structure. So that's a risk. You're shaking your head. No, I know. It's yeah. Oops, sorry. So yeah, we might want to talk about that question at some point.
Yeah, let's wait on questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks.
So let's now hear from Eva and Louise, who can speak to their experience on how LECs are both set up and also how they work.
Okay.
You're also talking about TOPA, right? So I don't know.
Well, we were going to do TOPA last, but I don't know what.
TOPA is like really important in terms of talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll talk around it. I'm not sure. Maybe you can go the details on TOPA.
Yeah.
I've been doing, I've had experience with the co-op since 1981 when I was a fellow at Georgetown, but I went away for a while and came back. And when I came back to the District of Columbia Law School, it was so, UDC is well represented here. It's like, you know, I visited AU Law School, and they do great work there also. You know, fabulous work working with cooperatives, I know. From the business school as well. It's really odd to have volunteer business help. I can't tell you how much we need it. Anyway, when I first began, it was just a couple of years after the district enacted TOPA, and it is an amazingly progressive piece of legislation on a number of levels. I love it for the fact that it actually is a capital asset, and I'm not so worried about what people walk away from. It's what they get while they're there, that we all get from our homes that we own, and our neighborhoods that we control. And I'll tell you, it depends on how you set it up, but it actually can be set up in such a way that you can create a cushion for people, that more than you can in the rental. And I don't know if any of you remember Charles Rinker. He's from Arlington. Well, I worked on a number of projects with Charlie, and he was brilliant at making it work. He didn't displace people. The poorest of poor people stayed in the building, and we still managed to actually make some money for them in the long run when they choose to move. He was amazing, and I learned a lot from him. The important part of that is how important it is to have really good financial help and assistance in setting up. I can't tell you, that's so much more important than the law. You know, it's so much more important than so many other things to have some really good services. And one of the biggest drawbacks for us is the lack of those kinds of services. We don't have very many Charlies, and we certainly don't have very many decent management companies. A management company can take a project under. And so we're hoping to build that because we have enough co-ops now in the district where I think there's enough economic energy to actually set up some collectively held management companies and maybe pay a few more financial consultants. But anyway, when I first started, DC was worried about conversions to condominiums primarily, but also, you're mindful of right now the Airbnb, places turning into guest houses. That was almost as important. Units were being lost constantly on that basis. And so it was a break. The legislation, together with rent control, actually plays a role as well, was a real break on some of those processes. What I really love about the act is the time frame that slows things down. So when a project goes on the market, you've got 120 days. Actually, this time goes by really fast. You have 120 days to get to purchase agreement. That's probably one of the largest hurdles because of the pressures in the economy from the real estate folks. And the tricks that they'll do anything to get around the statute. But you get 120 days to get to an agreement, and then you get another 120 days to get financing. And then, if you get just somebody to write you a letter of interest, you get another 120 days. You've got about a year, almost a year's time to get things together, which is not that much time, but it can be done. So those are sort of the critical moments, I think, in the development of the co-op. The long term, however, I think is vastly more important. You need to have constant assistance, like any business. These folks are coming, I have to tell you, my experience with the board of directors, people may question whether low wealth people can handle, this kind of business. Well, guess what? They handle money better than most of us. I've never, if I spend one more meeting arguing over 25 cents spent on, a phone call from the management company, I think I'll, jump out the window. But the folks really do pay attention to financials, and they really get it. They really understand financials, and it is very, very possible to have a very, very competent and responsible board within a short period of time. But they all need assistance getting there. So we are lucky in the District of Columbia organizers to have people who know how to step in and have a fairly strong support for organizations for co-ops to help them move forward. I'm trying not to ramble, and I don't want to step over on the things. So those are the important things about TOPA, and if we can get into the details. I think you want to know what the challenges are from the economic forces. And when you're in a hot market, it can be very difficult to do them because the prices really shoot up, and you have to work really quickly. And there's a pressure on the co-ops to actually take. There's an escape valve that's written into law. It was meant to be a good thing, but the tenants in a building. I need to back up and say there's another important aspect of the law which everyone should have, and that is a break on the conversions. In order to have a conversion from a rental building into other kinds of ownership, condominium or cooperative, there has to be a tenant election. And that's every building in the district that converts. That's extraordinarily important. And it's important for two reasons. One, it actually gives the individuals in the building an economic bargaining chip. So even if they can't move forward and many people are critical of this, I'm not. If they can't move forward and buy the building for some reason, there is a bargaining chip. And they can get some value from the developer out of the deal. I don't favor those. We try not to have our organizations go that way because they do so much better if they stay in, economically and socially in many other ways. But there is that's built into the law, which is helpful, and it also puts a brake on the pressure for conversions. It's quite good. If you do something here, I hope you would do that as well. I know you probably have condominium conversions here. What else about the law? The time frames are really important. But what's most important outside of the law, we can all help you write a law and bring in all the experts who wrote this one and tell you all the problems we're having with it, is to have the financing available. Because you can't, fine, the law could be great, but if you don't have financing, it's a major, you just can't do it. And so we have the Housing Production Trust Fund at the district where real estate taxes from settlements, both transfer taxes and recording taxes, are put into a fund. And this is great because it doesn't have to go through budget every year. It's a dedicated fund that goes into the Housing Production Trust Fund, which is not just used for cooperatives. frankly, we're getting a lot more competition from other kinds of developments right now, but it does help fund, and tremendously so, there's like $100 million in there now, fund tenant purchases. And the other thing, though, that's really important is to have supportive financing from the outside. We've worked, almost always had a nonprofit involved with short-term financing. The problem for nonprofits is their financing is going to be short-term because of the way their own money system works. But you can sometimes get a 7-year loan to get you started. Or what's been really important recently for us is the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which you haven't dealt with. You should. They're very helpful. The list will come in and do a bridge loan. We also worked with another organization, the Sisters of Mercy did it for us. Actually, Charlie was probably the first one to do it in the district, to get a nonprofit to do a bridge loan so that you could get in within your time frame, get the building bought with a bridge loan, and then do a subsequent series of financing with the district to get development money and to pay off the bridge loan. And that's actually how we're doing it right now. I don't know if we can do it without Lisa stepping in and acting as quickly as they do. So that's really important to have a financial structure, and that may be even more important than having a law. Because if you've got the money available, you know, the real estate will be there. At some point, the market could go down, and with less pressure, the owners become quite eager to sell, you know, to the tenant organization. So I'll stop there because I could go on forever. I just want to tell you a story though. It's so much fun to go into the buildings. We stay with the clients. We don't just help them buy and then walk away. One building that I've been representing, this is a Charlie deal since 2000. I go there and I see these kids I've known, you know, for 17 years, or been their families for 17 years. And these kids are going to college, you know. It's a remarkably stabilizing environment if the co-op is done correctly and has the appropriate support. So if you all get started, I'm happy to come right along.
I could go next, or I don't know if you want to build. Okay. I'll talk a bit about some of like the legal and sort of technical aspects of the co-op so that you sort of understand how it really is structured. So basically it's a general cooperative association typically, and that's a particular business entity in DC, and I don't think Virginia necessarily. They might have a cooperative structure. I think they probably do, because there's most states have like consumer cooperative statutes. So you know, you can probably use that statute, or Delaware Corporation. Actually, we have some co-ops that actually are formed as Delaware Corporation, which provides, you know, a bit more of a flexible structure. They're a bit controversial because, you know, you can change the bylaws very easily. The cooperative structure, there's certain things that the entire membership, meaning like the tenants, the residents, have to vote on, and with the Delaware Corporation, you know, some of that could be taken away. But some lawyers do advise. So anyway, but most in DC, the General Cooperative Association basically is formed at the beginning of the process, in which, you know, until the process is happening at a certain point in that process, the residents form that organization. They have, you know, their incorporators, etc. And then that organization, the tenant association, basically assigns its rights. The tenant association assigns its rights to the cooperative association, so that kind of becomes the cooperative association, and then that cooperative purchases the building. I'm actually not the expert on this, so please correct me. I only work with co-ops after they're formed, but that's basically the gist of it.
You were working at a forming co-op.
No, I only work with co-ops after they're formed. But anyway, so then what happens is the resident, you know, the tenants, then they start subscribing. They become subscribers or members. They have to purchase membership shares. They can either call memberships or shares, and that kind of gives them that ownership interest. They become in cash. They're lower income, but the setup with that was that there were some share loans available, and nonprofit lender was providing share loans, but those are not often available. So I don't recommend that type of structure for limited equity co-ops unless you are like absolutely have some guarantee with regard to share loans. So anyway, so people, you know, purchase, the residents, they purchase their shares, they become members, and they elect a board of directors, and the board of directors is basically the manager of the organization, and they often, you know, the city often requires, and also all advisors recommend that cooperatives hire management companies, but the board of directors really is supposed to manage the management company, because as everyone said, there's no management company that is affordable enough and, you know, really cares that much about limited equity co-ops. Some of them kind of know what they're doing, but they just don't put the resources into these limited equity co-ops often. They don't put adequate resources in to be able to function properly, in my view. So you need to have like the board of directors oversight, as well as it's great to have, you know, technical advisors and lawyers, like really kind of making sure that the management company is doing its job and filling in gaps, like asset managers, et cetera, organizers. But anyway, so basically, you know, residents continue to stay in their homes, and you know, you have elections every year. There's again certain things that members vote on. There's supposed to be annual meetings every year. Most things are governed by the bylaws. So our statute, our cooperative statute, is fairly vague. So there's a lot that's like that needs to be put in the bylaw processes, or house rules, you know, like more detailed rules and policies with regard to what, you know, whether people are allowed to smoke or not, and that kind of stuff. And so those are all set up. You know, at membership meetings, aside from elections that occur, there's also the opportunity for members to vote on the termination of someone else's membership. So that's like it's a very different process from the typical sort of eviction process in DC, and it's actually quite controversial because tenants, renters have really strong rights in DC, and with co-ops, as soon as if their membership is terminated, in other words, if the entire membership decides that they should not be in the co-op anymore, usually it's because they're not paying their carrying charges every month. That's the main reason usually. And it seems like there's nothing that's going to improve their situation. That's usually when members vote to terminate. At that point, they can basically be evicted pretty easily. So again, that's a little controversial because some people in limited equity should be based on like objective criteria. They shouldn't really, they obviously have to follow fair housing law. And that's actually really big, I think, a bit of a challenge sometimes with co-ops because fair housing law, especially in DC, we have a DC Human Rights Act, is quite complicated. There's a lot of protections, and so basically unless there's a really tangible reason like someone can't afford to be there or their income is too high, they don't really fit this income criteria, they could run into sticky situations with rejecting someone for some, you know, and that's, I guess that's similar when it comes to evicting someone. Like there should be a very tangible terminating someone's membership. There should be a very tangible reason for evicting them. Yeah, how much more time do I have? I might be running out, but I'll just like wrap up by saying I work with a number of with my initiative. I work with a number of cooperatives. Some of them are very old, but they've been around for 30 years. Some of them are new, and you know, they each face different challenges. I would say that sometimes their boards are very engaged, doing well. Sometimes their boards become tired, very tired over the years, especially the smaller co-ops where like you can't really have like a rotation as much because there's only so many people there to be on the board. And so that becomes, I think, a big challenge. And then, of course, like just this tension always between raising carrying charges, the monthly fees, and housing conditions, making repairs. It just becomes, if there's not proper financing, if they're not receiving grants or subsidized loans, or even if they are receiving loans, they have to pay off the loans. There's still often a tension between, a lot of groups don't want to raise their carrying charges. It's really hard. It's a hard thing to decide to do. But then, of course, residents, sometimes there's just not enough money in their budget to pay for repairs or these rehabs. So that's definitely a tension that I see a lot. And of course, management, communities, talked about a million times. But generally, you know, they're mostly doing okay. Like they're surviving. So, and some of them are just have great communities, and they're still living in some of the most affordable places in their neighborhoods. So, let's conclude with that.
So I'll just talk briefly about TOPA, because TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act, is one of the ways that you can turn a building into an LEC. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways. And so what the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act does in DC is it says that if a landlord wants to sell a property, they have to give the tenants a chance to buy it. And you know, you think on paper that would mean that the landlord would call up the tenants like in a meeting and say, would you like to buy the building? But that rarely happens that way unless it's a small building, you know, with 4 units. Instead what happens is the landlord contracts a sale, and then they are required to give what's known as a TOPA notice, which means that everybody in the building receives notice that the building has been sold, and they have the right to refuse the sale as a tenants association and purchase the building instead. So, and again, in DC, unless you're looking at, and the law is slightly different for buildings 4 and under in terms of units and 5 and over. So if you are in a typical apartment building, there's more than 5 units or 5 and above. So what happens is you get a TOPA notice. If nobody in the building knows each other, sometimes nothing happens. It just, the sale goes forward. If people know each other, then they start talking, and then they start reaching out to DC organizations like Eva's and Louise's and you know, CNHED and other organizations in DC that work pretty much just on this to help it happen. And then they go through the TOPA process. And what's really neat about the TOPA process that I think is, it is so progressive, is that it gives the tenants a chance to do what they want with the building. So I went through a TOPA process in 2003, although the process began in 2001, it takes a while to unfurl. And I was not living in a low-income neighborhood, but I was living in a disinvested building. Like there were 5 buildings owned by a landlord, and one of the buildings did not have enough electrical voltage to like turn your hairdryer on and use the microwave. Not that you should do those in close proximity, but like if you've got 2 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment, someone's trying to, you know, warm up some tea, and someone else is trying to blow dry their hair, you know, it would blow up and stuff. Not blow up, but you know,
that happens in single family homes too.
Yeah.
When they're old.
Yeah, and so it allows you. But anyway, so in my case, you know, we weren't a low-income building, but we had some people that had been in the building for so long that their rents were low. So it wasn't a low income building, but we had low income and lower middle income families and individuals in the building. So what TOPA allowed us to do, and at the time I didn't realize how expansive it was, you can refuse the sale, and then you secure financing, which is a whole other can of worms. I won't dig into that right now, but you secure financing, and then you can convert the building to condo. You can convert to a typical co-op that's not limited equity, or you can convert to an LEC, which is a limited equity co-op, or you can remain rental. And what you're basically doing is, when you refuse the sale, so if you're a landlord, you're the person that the landlord has contracted the sale to. So the tenants organization gets organized, and as the tenants organization refuses the sale, then they put out an RFP, so to speak, asking for other potential landlords that are interested in purchasing the building through the tenants. And that process is interesting, because basically people then send you proposals if you're on the tenant board, and you get to review, well, what are you going to do for my building? We have a mold problem in this building. We have joist deterioration in some buildings. These are all things that happen in my building, right? Like, we found out, like, our buildings, the reason the floor was slanting was because the joist was decaying. So there's all kinds of things, and then you can also ask for kind of nice things, like, I want a rooftop deck, or, I guess you could ask for a pool. No one really does it in DC, but you can ask for things, and then you can also, in this process of getting all of these proposals in a hot real estate market, you can get a lot of them. You can negotiate, and you can demand things. So TOPA is amazing, because if you're in a middle to upper middle income building, but you really don't have enough money to, like, become a homeowner, TOPA allows you to do that. And one of the things that you do in that process as a tenants association is say, okay, we want insider prices for people that choose to stay put, and in exchange for that, we'll allow you to offer buyouts. So some people that maybe students or people that are in town temporarily for a couple of years will take a buyout and leave the building and relinquish their right. So, but again, you can, low-income people can use this to create LECs. And what has happened in DC after the 2008 recession is the condo market, it's kind of picking up now, but for 4 or 5, 6 years after the recession, no developers would convert to condominium, even if tenants wanted to, because the rules and restrictions for FHA financing and having approval for the building were so strict that nobody wanted to do it. So then what you got to do as a tenant is to say, well, yeah, you can come in here, but these are the stipulations that we want. So the way I look at TOPA is it's very progressive, but you do have to be cautious. If you use a TOPA law to try to create LECs, it's a market right. It's not, you're not providing a service of low-income housing. You're giving tenants a chance to do what they want with their housing. And tenants are not always angelic, So, I mean, sometimes they want it to convert to condominium because they want to make a lot of money in a hot market. And so what I found in my book, I covered 7 properties sort of across the city, from Anacostia all the way over to Northwest, is that when you go through this process after the recession in particular, what ends up happening is you end up working with developers who will say, well, we're going to do all these fancy things in your building. We're going to give you a rooftop deck. We're going to give you new windows. We'll let you buy, upgrades to your unit for kitchens, but we want you to sign a voluntary agreement. And a voluntary agreement is one of the pathways in DC for raising rent above the capped amounts. And what a voluntary agreement says is if 70% of your tenants agree to above the cap rent increase, then the landlord can raise the rent to whatever they want. Now, typically, tenants will not do that. But in a TOPA process, what some tenants will do is say, well, we'll let you do a voluntary agreement on the units of the people that don't stay. And then when we leave the building, or we leave our unit, then you can raise the rent right up to the cap, to the agreement that you've set with the voluntary agreement, which is up to market rate. So what I think is great about TOPA is it gives you these options for LECs and things like this, but you also have to be careful because it's a market solution that you don't want the market to take it over and basically destroy your low-income housing stock. So for me, I look at TOPA and go, TOPA is a market solution that you basically need to bend to non-market purposes. And LEC is an example of that. And so if you're writing the statute, the challenge is to think, how do you write the statute so that it cannot be used to harm low-income housing? Or, you can define that in different ways in terms of the AMI and stuff, but that you don't want it to be a situation where a building can basically, through a voluntary agreement, even though it goes through a tenant purchase process, can basically become gentrified overnight. And so for me, I think in DC, we need to get rid of the voluntary agreements in the TOPA process. But there's other ways to think about this too. So, this is totally kind of off the cuff, so take it for what it is. But, if you use housing production trust fund money, it require, for example, that a certain number of units will be covenanted at particular rents, right? You find ways to use this market principle for non-market purposes. Because, as Louise said, developers will find any possible squeaky little tiny hole, and they will squeeze right through it with a battering ram. And so you have to constantly be on top of it. And one thing about DC, which honestly drives me mad, is they have this beautiful right, and they haven't tracked it properly. They're beginning to try to track it, but when I first decided to do research on this, I was like, okay, I want the data. I'm going to be a science nerd and my normal life, and I'm going to try to figure out what, if this number of buildings went through a TOPA process, how many went rental, how many went condo, co-op, LEC, how many failed. There's no data. So that means you can't kind of, overview macro understand the ways developers abuse the system or the way that you could make it work more effectively. So that's all I have to say.
That's true. It's amazing that there's no data. It is totally amazing because all of them have to be registered and filed with a particular office.
When I called DCRA, this was 10 years ago now, and said, can you give me a list of all the buildings that have gone through a TOPA process? And they sent me this beautiful data set, and then I talked to a lawyer just look what I found, and he's like, that's not what you think it is. And I'm like, what is it? And he says, it's just buildings that have converted to condo. But buildings can convert to condo outside of a TOPA process. So it was useless data. And so there's, CNHED, and I think you guys are all involved in trying to track it now. But this law has been in place since in the early 1980s. So it would be beautiful to be able to really track this and see, well, what happened to TOPA in the early 80s when there was gentrification going on? What happened in the 90s when there were almost no housing starts? What happened in 2000 to 2005? What happened right in that period where things were just going
2007, I can tell you.
Yeah, bonkers, right? And then what happened after 2008? So that for example, with an LEC, if you want to kind of shepherd an LEC to fruition or survival, that what kinds of pressures are there at different times. And so the data, if you guys do a law, it should be written in the law that somebody has to collect this data, and it needs to be public, and it needs to be super dense, super detailed. Sorry, I just get really annoyed about the data.
So thank you guys so much. So we can open it up to questions. By the way, I don't know if everybody got the materials. So just especially if you'd like to direct one of your questions to a particular speaker, it might be helpful to.
Well,
Okay. Yeah.
so I don't know who to direct this to, but I'm having trouble understanding the underlying economics of this. So if I understood it correctly, the co-op entity is the owner of the land and the shell, and then gets a loan, gets a mortgage for that. So it has to be if this is a hot market, it has to be a fairly big mortgage, right? And then, but it's the co-op entity is selling membership shares for very, very little and keeping the rents or the carrying charges very, very low. So how do they pay back the loan is my question.
Yeah, we're going through a lot of financing right now. Almost all of our projects right now are in development financing, even the ones that have been in existence for a while. It's the co-op is owned by a single entity,
Right.
the cooperative corporation. So it's in that way very similar to a rental.
Right.
So the blanket loan you can get, as Eva mentioned, the blanket loan, and this is actually what makes it workable for low wealth people. Is the financing covers the entire building and the cooperative itself pays the mortgage. you can get, if you're lucky, you can get share loans, you can get capital to come in, and offset some of the capital expense at the beginning, when people have share loans, but usually that doesn't happen. You can, in the district, the Home Purchase Assistance Program was providing funds so people could buy in. You could have low wealth people buy in. So for example,
They don't do that anymore.
no, they don't do it, but they did. And one building that we've done where everyone is actually doing quite well in Columbia Heights, they put in, you could get a loan up to $70,000, a low wealth person could get. So that was amazingly helpful getting us started. So, but then the balance of the financing is paid through the monthly carrying charges. But you can never do it with just one loan. You may have 3 or 4 financing sources that you rely on. Most of them will be short term and need to be paid off as you sell your units, which is why so many are forced into condominium actually. Because one of the ones I worked on was quite successful because we were able to sell the condominium shares off with vacant units to really subsidize the cost of the existing tenants. And the condominium at the time was the only way to do it. If we had a New York market, we could do that same thing. People just have a different attitude towards the cooperatives. You could do that same thing with cooperatives and use those vacant units to really subsidize your existing low wealth people. So anyway, so it's a blanket financing. It's run like it's just it's very similar to how a rental housing would be set up.
Right. Well,
To piggyback off that last nugget you just said is, well, if this was New York, a co-op. Because in New York, you do co-ops and condos are kind of like, well, you know, that's kind of strange. You actually found a condo. So could you just what's your impression of how, if you decide to go co-op or condo, how that really works in a market like ours? You kind of hinted at it, but do you see it changing or not? That perception, co-op versus condo, and what people, what future potential low wealth residents will look at when they think of the American dream of home ownership in this area. Is it co-op or is it condo?
Well, I mean, DC also has a lot of very high wealth co-ops too.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
So we have co-ops, not
Kennedy Warren.
right, exactly. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, and not what's the Wyoming. I think
There's one of the buildings is.
Wyoming is
Yeah.
Well, that was before there was a condo
Anyway.
statute, so it was like.
Right. I mean, there was condos weren't invented until the '70s. So, but yeah, so that's been a way people have owned, wealthy people have owned apartments as co-ops for a long time. But I guess
I think it could happen.
Yeah.
Because you have so much more control in a co-op over
Right.
your living environment. Which again is even suggests you have to be careful about what kind of control we're talking about here. And that is the problem in New York, right? But it does enable people to solve well, when the 2007 crisis hit, the real problem for condominiums was people walking away or not paying their condominium charges. And the condominium is in such a much more precarious position than a co-op in that situation. Because the co-op can terminate that membership and move that person out and perhaps put someone else back in who will actually pay. Whereas a condominium, you have to wait for that person, that condo unit owner, mortgage company to foreclose. And of course, they were running away like, during that period of time. And so the co-op actually has a lot of economic stability that a condominium in a bad economy will not have. So maybe that's how we change people's minds.
And the other thing is like, so if you're a low income building or you're a mixed income building, but you've got a significant portion of your residents who are low income, then the condo option probably won't work without some people having to leave. So the LAC model becomes attractive to, as a way to give everyone a chance at a version of home ownership instead of just deciding to stay rental.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, just before the question, I wanted to add that there's also various tax advantages with our law. I mean, I don't know if it's actually our laws or regulations, but there's like a 5-year tax abatement law, right? For a low, yeah. There's also, they can get homestead deductions, which are like typical home ownership tax deductions on the entire co-op. co-op does and it passes along.
Yeah, folks
They actually, can get the home mortgage interest deduction, but now that that's changed, I actually don't think it's gonna be available, so they can take small, if they're itemizing. Co-op members actually can deduct their share of the mortgage interest.
Yes, you may be aware that Arlington County does not have or foster co-ops. And as a result, it has lost, it has about 3,000 affordable market rate garden apartment units out of 20,000 that it had around the year 2000. So it has lost well over 2/3 of its affordable housing stock. And the latest to go was in my own neighborhood. All the tenants in my building, there are 10 units, and the building next door, 8 units, were given notice last week to get out. Our buildings are going to be demolished and going to be replaced with luxury townhomes. Now, what's so interesting about this development is, in an effort to forestall this, last December, the county created something called a historic conservation district throughout the county in areas where garden apartments remain, to prevent them from being demolished. Now, of course, because Virginia is a very strong by right state, they could not outright ban the demolitions, but they amended the zoning ordinance to require site plan approval for actions such as my current landlord plans to do. Now, 2 days after this ordinance went on the books, the landlord filed for a demolition permit. He is no longer by law permitted to do that. So I realized what his ploy was. He wants to have this permit denied so that he can go in and sue the county for the ordinance for infringing on their property rights. Now, this has all been legislated by the landlord and his partners, one of whom is a major developer called NDR. These people, have huge drafts of corporate lawyers, etc. And of course, these people have completely upended the county's plans. So tenants consulted the county, and they learned from county staff that though the county might try to prevent these demolitions from actually occurring, the tenants have no right whatsoever, and all parties, the developer, the county, the lawyers employed by both sides agree all tenants must be out, and that's it. So what I would like to do, and now during the course of this, so we see that this law that they passed last December is completely toothless. It has it will not in effect preserve the affordable housing. And many people have discussed.
The historic district,
It's toothless.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
I just wanted to make sure
I'm
that-
witness to that fact.
Yeah.
The only thing that could possibly preserve these units as affordable is the law that you're talking about. But county is tone deaf. There had no such discussion, to my knowledge, has ever occurred on the board or among the commissions of jurisdiction. So I do believe that there's nothing you can do for me. But is it possible?
I have a question though.
Is it possible that one or the other of you could consult with the county and say, hey guys, we've just learned that this ordinance that you think was your silver bullet isn't going to work. We have something that will. Is it possible that you can consult with the county? They will not listen to us.
Okay, I'm not clear on, I read a little bit about Virginia's structure, but I don't know for sure how it works. It doesn't look like the county has very many powers. When I looked at it, it doesn't look like the county would have the power to, for example, adopt the TOPA law, although a county could try, why not?
The state has to approve it, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well then, okay, so then the issue will be, can you consult with the county to consult with its own state delegation?
Sure, I mean, that would be
I mean,
possible.
these people are not aware of any other options.
The other question I had for you though, it's just that somebody would answer in the room for me, because I'm curious about this. The zoning should be a local level ordinance, it's not?
It was.
Okay.
And it's completely toothless.
Well, you can accomplish some things with zoning, but maybe not.
Can I ask a question about that? So the way they changed zoning it just said they can't tear it down, but there's no protection, so why is the city
All right, yeah,
demanding
actually,
to leave?
it was a two-phase ordinance. First, they declared what is known as a housing conservation district comprising discrete neighborhoods throughout the county that have not yet been demolished, okay? And then they said that they wanted to provide incentives to the existing landlords to renovate rather than tear down. And in order to do that, they basically declared a moratorium. They said, we are declaring this new zoning overlay, okay? But no demolitions will occur until we have established a plan for providing incentives to preserve. Okay, so now, at that point, once those incentives are on the table, the landlord has two options. He can proceed with demolition provided he gets site plan approval to do so, or he can take the incentives. Now, the whole issue has been completely forestalled and upended because the landlord, not wishing the developers, aware of this plan, have decided to sue the county. They haven't actually initiated a court case yet, but the likelihood is that they will sue the county to overturn the ordinance.
So why are they forcing you out while that process is going on?
Because tenants have no right whatsoever.
It's better to have an empty building.
I mean, the actual property has more rights than I have.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess a little explanation. I guess that the housing conservation district, they just passed like phase 1. They haven't come up with phase 2 is still in process, which would be the incentives. They haven't come up with the incentives yet. But my question was, Arlington County, related to what Audrey said, Arlington County does not have the same history as DC, doesn't have the same laws, housing laws, it doesn't have the same laws regarding tenants, and it doesn't have the same history of the things that you guys were talking about. So the county has lost affordable units, and they realize they're actually looking into community land trust as a group, discussing that. We're looking into, accessory dwelling units. There's 4 units in a new building that are going to be from purchase for $200,000, and they're looking in condo conversions. So I guess my question is, why would limited equity cooperatives? Why would, considering the county situation, why would that be a good alternative for Arlington County?
For me, it's a huge advantage is the rate that it puts on the surges in the economy. It sort of evens things out a bit to have this, but also, it's been it's financing that you can use for a cooperative versus a condominium, various things like that. It might not always be the right thing, but there are some.
I just want to add that you also don't need to form the co-op to like a TOPA type law. I could think of it with Norwood, for example, they actually force their landlord to sell the building to them. So if there's a group of, the organizing is really strong. So if you have a bunch of tenants who are have housing conditions issues, and they're just really organized and they're getting good press and that kind of thing, and they want the landlord to fix the building, and one of the options is, or you could just sell it to us. That's an option. So if there's some financing available, if the city somehow commits to, prioritizing affordable housing financing for those kinds of buildings, and the tenants are really organized, I don't think you need a law necessarily to make it happen.
Enforcement is important. One of our buildings that Eva worked on when she worked with me, we got through a plea bargain. The owner was being prosecuted for the conditions of the building. Actually, a former student of mine was the prosecutor, was willing to put him in jail. And so he finally agreed to sell the building. So there are various types of ways that you can bring about changes of your own pressures of your own kind, not just necessarily the right to purchase.
Yeah, my comment was because I knew Charlie for such a long time, and we all knew of his work with co-ops in DC, and we thought, well, if everybody just listens to Charlie, then why can't we do this here in Arlington? And no, we can't.
He tried.
Yeah, he did. He tried and tried. And there were a lot of public, people would get this and they do, oh, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. And a lot of it does have to do with our state, with regulations and how much the local government's hands are, if we listen to this and it sounds fabulous, you're like, my gosh, why aren't we doing this in Arlington? Well, there really doesn't, it does not look optimistic. It doesn't look optimistic. We can't even raise a cigarette tax in Arlington. We can't do that kind of stuff. Nevertheless, I think the more that everybody learns about, well, gee, look what they're doing over there, to create that greater conversation about how can we get there. Right now, we have no public housing in Arlington, but we do have committed affordable housing that has been developed by nonprofit developers. And so that's been the way that we've been able to move. In Audrey's neighborhood, the nonprofit developers were able to buy. They tried to move as fast as they could, and it was only because of the behind-the-scenes promises that they were getting from the county board to say, well, yeah, we can try and allocate some of, what we use is a loan program so that the county can loan money to the nonprofit developer and then can get some, what do we call them, the low income tax credit. LIDICs. Okay, so then they can get LIDICs and put, the patchwork that has to go together to finally do that. But it's, we're just, the stream of losing housing that we just cannot, we came up with a wonderful affordable housing master plan that said at that point in time, we had 17.7% of our rental housing was affordable at 60% AMI and below. So we thought, okay, fine, we can't get back what we had, all right? Horses out the, all right, so let's do this, 17.7%, which would mean that we'd have to be doing, what is it, Pat? 600 a year, 600 units a year.
Net.
And because we're losing more than 600 every year, and if all we can do is with our nonprofit partners is come up with 450 or 300.
You need dedicated revenues. You don't necessarily need TOPA. You need dedicated revenues, and maybe some land trusts.
Yes.
Well, that's
And-
what people looks like, and that looks like something that maybe we can move.
The other thing is for one thing, I love by the way the use of the urban commons notion. Vacant properties in my estimation, belongs to the public. That is ours, and it gets snapped up for nothing by developers, and it should belong to the public. It is a common, and so if you could get your county to sort of think about vacant property that way, you could get a land bank going.
I don't think we have any. We had no foreclosures in 2008. Housing values did not drop in Arlington.
So you may not have much vacant property, but you may have buildings that are in, some
Pretty
cities,
decrepit, yeah.
some cities will actually permit, if it's bad enough, you can step in, you've got the police power to do that, to step in and condemn a building and take it. That's.
Well, there is no eminent domain.
It's not eminent domain, it's police power.
Oh, okay.
You condemn buildings and you fine them out of existence, if they are not being repaired. And cities like Baltimore, for example, have the first right of refusal for nonprofit organizations, which might be more palatable in your state.
Silver Spring is doing something about this too. Tom Hucker, who's on the Silver Spring, or on the Montgomery County Council, he just put, and I don't know the details of it, but he put in a law about getting vacant. It's more about not seeing the neighborhoods decline, but it allows the city to much more quickly take over vacant housing that where the taxes aren't being paid and it's not being maintained. And then, you know, Montgomery County is pretty progressive, but I don't know that they have a good plan for what they're gonna do with those houses. But, you know, that's something that.
They're progressive, but they also have the legal ways
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
We have progressive people here, but we do not have the legal.
Well, I mean, with
ways.
him, it's progressive legislation, but it was also a blight issue. So like, there's a house on my street that, you know, I don't know, it just, no one's there, but every once in a while they come and mow the grass, and people have been complaining about it for 5 years. And so, you know, his legislation is speeding that process along of the city taking over vacant housing. And it's not a huge bunch of houses like that, but, you know, it adds up. And if you have properties like that that are rental, you know.
There was some talk at these different housing groups that, do you do any rentals? Like 2 units in a big building?
Yeah, you know, like a co-op that has some rental units.
You could,
inside.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, I think one thing in terms of the financing question that you asked earlier, I mean, another piece of that pie is using housing choice voucher program vouchers.
Yeah.
And co-op members who are very low income, who are receiving vouchers, can use those to pay their co-op carrying charges. And that's actually that's great for the co-op because it's a dedicated income stream. And sometimes, I'd be curious to see what your experience is with this, but sometimes what the housing choice voucher will pay is higher than even the carrying charges. So it's actually to great benefit of the co-op. It's usually higher. It's more income than this low income person is generating for them. So that's a nice kind of little income stream. So that can be used to help finance things. And also to the financing question, there are 0 interest loans the city provides, but that you have to pay back, but there's no interest. So that helps.
And I also sometimes forget.
And the city will forgive loans, yeah.
Or just ignore them.
Right, or use half of them, really is what happens.
It's that lack of data.
Yes.
I worked with Charlie Rinker too in the 80s, and Audrey mentioned, it's true, we're at what we call Dillon rural estate. So for many years, probably 10, Charlie and other activists here, we went down to Richmond, tried to get them to approve the TOPA Act, and we could never get it through because basically we have a corrupt General Assembly. You know, frankly, developers had more clout. We did start. I was personally involved 2 co-ops, housing co-ops started. The one still operates. In fact, I invited them to come here tonight. Colonial Village, which is down by the courthouse. It's about 100 members, but we had leverage. What we did was the developer, the owner, Mobile Oil Land Development Corporation, wanted to raise it, so we got it certified as a historic landmark. So he was willing to cut a deal. Now he did end up where I was living. Actually, the building got knocked down, but we did have a deal. Some of it was preserved by nonprofits. We have the housing co-op. The rest of them were condos. Another one was right here on the pike down here, Arlington Village, and that's exact. I invited Cecilia Cassidy, who was one of the founders. But just what you said, what happened? They cashed out. Things went up so high. In fact, Arlington has. We have a number of traditional black areas here, and a lot of them had housing co-ops. Right over here, North Green Valley, Arlington View up here. They were co-ops that started in maybe the post-World War II era, you know. But rising land values, boom, people cashed out. And so, you know, it was great for the person who was there. That's why Tim, the chair of our revolution, is very big on, it's sort of big on this. And I'm very skeptical because unless you had a community land trust, and people cash out, and you do all this work, the government puts in money, let's say there's always public assistance, and then they cash out, and that's great for the person who gets the benefit, but the next generation has nothing. And
Well,
so
that's been a huge debate.
that's why I'm very skeptical of co-ops.
Well, the co-op can't cash out until they've paid off their loan, and it's a big process.
In the district, we have 40-year restrictive covenants that the district provides.
Right, so it is a long, but you're right, there comes a point when it, that expires. And I do think, depending on the housing stock here too, it just might make more sense. And like you're saying, access to land is what kind of housing is available. A community land trust might make a lot more sense. I mean, it's the same idea of having housing that's been decommodified, taken off the market, is under community control. But with a land trust, a third of the members of the board are from the broader community, are not people living in the housing. And so then you have a larger, you have more community control. The flip side, the problem can be that then the people who live in the housing might not feel so much like owners, because somebody else is helping make decisions about their housing. So that's just something to think about.
There could be like having, having
No, I think
associations for each building that, weighs in some way.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's exciting to think about the land trust model here.
I mean, I have a question for you guys, in terms of Richmond. So, you said in the 80s you went down to Richmond and tried to talk about a TOPA statute. So Richmond is a little bit better than it was. I grew up in Virginia, so I was completely shocked by that. And my mother's been complaining for as long as I lived in DC, like, the federal assembly's rigged. And I'm like, I know, Mama, go vote anyway. But, and she does. But, it may be that, some of these new people don't know anything about TOPA, and now's the time to just start going down there and bringing up some options that they aren't familiar with. I mean, I'm thinking about Danica Roem, right? I mean, she's clearly interested in micro issues like traffic and things like that. I don't know that she's not in this district, but or this is not in her district, but it's just something where maybe it's time to go back to Richmond because it's a little more friendly.
And I also, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think part of the reason we have TOPA is because we had an incredibly progressive city council and mayor in the late 70s, and because we had tenant organizing, really strong tenant organizing. And that's why we have what we have. It's because tenants organized and made it happen. And so I
voted.
think, and I totally hear you, but it's can be really discouraging to just keep trying to press for this change and not see anything happening. But yeah, maybe now is a time when people are realizing it's just not sustainable for our community to not have some community control over land, and maybe, I mean, just like in the late 70s was an incredible explosion of tenant organizing in DC, and we got lots of great tenant legislation passed. TOPA was one of many laws, so maybe now's a good time for Virginia, I don't know.
And particularly if you're solving a problem. I mean, and it seems to me that most cities like Arlington are going to understand that it's not in economic interest to lose your affordable housing. And what's happened in DC in the areas where we've lost it, with in Columbia Heights, for example, we've managed to save a couple of buildings there, but they now have all of these condominiums that were because there's post 1979, they're not subject to rent control, that were developed with these yuppie, 1 and 2 bedroom, 3 places for these kids, young professionals, right, to move in. And of course they came in and now they're leaving, and they're not coming to DC anymore. And so now we have a glut in the condominium market in Columbia Heights and other places as well. And so we're going to have, we lost an incredible amount. I mean, that things happen in DC as well.
Yeah.
During that period of time, we lost an incredible number in Columbia Heights alone. Huge numbers of family-sized, family-amenable dwellings. So that happens everywhere. And if you just have to be on top of this stuff and let them know you don't want this. This is a bad thing. You're not. The next time all the kids start moving to California, or Canada, or whatever they're going on. If I were young enough, that's where I'd go. But anyway, where you go to New Mexico. My daughter-in-law is living at New Mexico.
I can't afford it.
My daughter-in-law.
I'm not kidding.
No, it's true. She's not, unfortunately. She's leaving us. Anyway,
So yeah, as I was listening to this, I've sort of been teased out, but one sort of flaw I saw here was, I was kind of appalled to hear that, after years of changing shares at a low amount, the last person holding the thing they could just decide to take all of the appreciation over the years. And I think the land trust is really the answer to this, where we're trying to develop a land trust in Arlington, and I feel like there's a lot of expertise in this room, and we probably need that expertise on this group that is trying to think about land trusts. So so anyone who's interested in trying to work on a land trust for Arlington, please let me know after this.
You should definitely be in touch with the Burlington Land Trust.
Right, and that's the it could be a limited equity cooperative on top of a land trust, and that seems like a perfect way to proceed.
It doesn't even have to be limited equity, I mean,
Right.
it can
Well,
be
we might-
anything, because you,
Yeah.
because as long as you're controlling the pricing on the land, you got it.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, fair enough,
Yeah.
sounds good.
I would also say, I'm not a big fan of like mixing the methods, but, one building I followed, the landlord owned two buildings, they shared a wall, but, you know, it was like the firewall, so it was two separate buildings, and he sold them, as a whole, and the tenants turned one into a condo to fund the co-op. And they did that without displacing anyone, because it was a disinvested building, it was, at the time, not exactly in a gentrifying area. And so the idea was you have a condominium, and that you use the proceeds of the sale of that to fund the co-op. Now, they ran into problems because their condo went on the market right after Bear Stearns collapsed.
Right, yeah.
So, assuming that Bear Stearns isn't gonna, or a version of it isn't gonna collapse like every 5 years or so, you know, that kind of timing was just very unfortuitous, but, it's a way to sort of say, okay, we can't, you know, do the whole shebang, but if we're gonna lose the whole thing, then let's see if we can find a way to make it, you know, partly market rate and partly not market rate. I mean, I don't think that's the go-to option, but like in a place where you don't have a lot of tenant-friendly laws, that might be one way to kind of strike a deal.
I would add that, yeah, and I think that sounds like a great option, because then you have two separate structures. I've seen some problems where, so, you know, it's buildings that are majority actually Section 8 voucher holders who like had some issues with financing, so then their development consultants decided to sell shares for $45,000. And so now you have new people coming in, and it's a bit more of an investment then, because they get like 3% of $45,000 when they sell, and people, you know, when they're paying in $45,000, it's like, it's not the same as the folks who are like just who want to live there, and they're staying in their homes for many years. So you have these tensions. I described them before, and so when it's within that one structure, when people are paying vastly different amounts, there's some conflict. So it's working okay, but I think having like two separate kind of structures.
Most community land trusts permit an appreciation, particularly with their home ownership. In Troy Gardens, you can go on the web, you can Google Troy Gardens, which is one in Madison, Wisconsin, that's been around for a long time, and you can look at their documents. They're up there, right on the website. In Burlington, I don't know, probably has some stuff too.
Like 25% of the, I mean, there's also 24%.
The appraised value, you can do it based on the appraisal values and fair market value when you move in. Person's going to buy in at lower than fair market, but you could say you get the difference between 25% of the fair market value of the that you bought in at and your sales price, for example. There are different ways. That's what Troy Gardens does. The different ways of allowing. I mean, I have no problem with allowing people their investment. I mean, we all take advantage. Any of us that has a single-family home takes advantage of that. I mean, my kids went to college based on that investment, and it was a very good thing for us. So why would we deprive other people of that if we can possibly make it work? It's just a matter of keeping it under control, which the community and land trust, and there are other ways of doing it as well. But yeah, anyway, get off my soapbox now.
Are there any more questions?
I do have one. I mean, the scenario, all of these scenarios contemplate existing housing stock that converts. Are you aware of anything, not Monterey, in Spain, but in the U.S., where an LEHC was developed on undeveloped land? That people said, let's build one of these things. There's a vacant lot over there. Let's just do it from scratch.
Yeah, well, I mean, Nehemiah Cooperative in DC and 14th and Belmont was built from scratch as a limited equity co-op. Yeah.
How do they get together? How do they find each other? I mean, people organize that.
Well, that's a good question. I don't really know the full history of Nehemiah, but there was a group that was from Washington inner city self-help. I mean, there was a group that was doing a lot of tent organizing in that neighborhood, and they, specifically Columbia Heights and Shaw, and they were organizing and working with low-income tenants who wanted to own a home in Columbia Heights. Yeah, but it was I don't know the details of the financing. Maybe you do.
I know. But I'm with Metro IF, and we have
Okay.
Nehemiah Homes Project promulgating it. That was brought down by Martin Trimble down
Okay.
and started doing tenant organizing
Okay, cool.
in DC with a very similar standard. We haven't gotten that far yet on Arlington or Alexandria yet, but.
But that's, I mean, and there's lots of, California, I mean, there's other
Yeah.
examples of.
There's
work
one
up
in
from
DC
scratch.
too, I read an article, but I mean, basically like the developer developed a project and the co-op is, there was gonna be some sort of manager and they decided to sell shares to people who wanted to buy shares. I mean, you don't necessarily have that community that's in place, which could be problematic, but I don't know.
Is it utopian to assume that a land trust in Arlington would take over land and sponsor a co-op from the ground up?
Well, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the
You're
only
the
one.
only
No, I mean, I don't think it's out of the question. I really
What?
don't. I think we're, at the very beginning stages of looking at this, but it's gonna require loans.
Yeah.
We've identified properties already.
Yeah.
I mean, my concern is, because I work with the Democrats and with our revolution, but one of my areas is NOC.
Mhm.
And so, we've identified places and we want to keep, the historic community has gone down and down and down and down. We want to keep the remaining historic community there and in affordable housing, and, we're working with the Civic Association. I think it's doable, but,
So who are the go-to, you kind of hinted at some of the go-to finance folks, who are the go-to banks? Are there, I mean, I guess it seems to be counterintuitive to think there's REITs that do this, but something that's like a REIT that would do something like this? Like, where do you go when you need the money?
Well, actually, I use consultants. we work with consultants. We have CDFIs, aren't very rich, but they'll do some gap financing. Local Initiative Support Corporation, the National Housing Trust.
The City First, City First Bank, it's a DC bank.
It's a community development finance. They don't have a lot of money, but
The National Co-op Bank.
the National Co-op. I've never had. All the co-ops I've done, I've never actually.
Really?
They do finance, yeah.
They do financing, but
They prefer.
National what bank
yeah,
is
they're
that?
kind of more money.
National Co-op Bank.
Co-op bank.
No, they've been.
They do some. They do it. I've just never done it. But there's, then you need public. I mean, if you're going to do low well, you absolutely need to have public funds. It's just the nonprofits have the wrong cycle. They can't give you 40-year loans.
There's one called Cooperative Development Institute, I think, they're based in like Minnesota or something. But there's a couple of like NCB co-ops.
It's not financing, but there's something called Grounded Network Solutions, which is the new name for the National Community Land Trust Network. Or maybe it's just called Grounded Solutions. Yeah, Grounded Solutions. It's the national network of community land trusts, so they would be good to get. Good thinking about land trusts.
Well, thank you, Amanda, Eva, Louise, Carolyn, thank you for coming.
Thank you.